Alright guys, welcome to the review video for the test that you're going to have tomorrow. Now, remember that this test is going to be over westward expansion, a little bit of government stuff, okay? I decided to do the video this way so that it wouldn't be super long, so we're going to cover like 5 or 6 main topics. I'm going to go through them. Hopefully you'll feel like this will, help you with anything you didn't understand, okay? So here we go. First thing we want to talk about on the test for tomorrow is government, okay? Now, you already took a quiz over the Articles of Confederation, so you should know that stuff pretty well. But if you don't, just remember that the Articles of Confederation was the first government for the United States. It was the first sort of written constitution. And the guys created this, the founding fathers, created this when they were doing the Revolutionary War, and it was supposed to be the government to sort of help us make it through the war and have sort of an orderly country. The problem with the Articles is that it was too weak, and it was too weak because they let the states have the majority of the power, okay? They were nervous about creating a strong central government that could, be tyrannical like the king they were fighting against, and they didn't want that. So they created a government that couldn't enforce its laws. It had a legislative branch, but no executive or judicial branch, and they didn't have the power to tax, and without the power to tax, they did not have a military to enforce their laws. And then the event that showed the founding fathers that the government was too weak was Shays' Rebellion. And remember, Daniel Shay was that farmer in Massachusetts who was angry because the government in Massachusetts was going to take his land and throw him in jail because he couldn't pay for his taxes. And so instead, he goes and he fights against the Massachusetts government, and there's nobody to stop him because there's no military, okay? So after Shays' Rebellion, the founding fathers, Jefferson and Washington and Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, and all these guys get together, James Madison, and they get together and they're like, we need to write a new government. And so what they come up with is the U.S. Constitution, and they have that constitutional convention in Philadelphia in secret where they throw out the articles and they start writing this new government that we've had since then. But what we need to know is that during the Constitutional Convention, there were a couple of arguments that happen, right? The first argument that they have is this argument between big states and small states. The Virginia plan was the big state plan, and they thought that big states should have more power in Congress, remember, the legislative branch. And they thought that when they say big states, they're saying like states with big populations, not the land of the state, right? And the New Jersey plan thought that every state should have the same amount of power, okay? And this turned into a big argument, and they eventually combined the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan into this thing called the Great Compromise. And the Great Compromise establishes the 3 branches of government: judicial, legislative, executive. It establishes the bicameral Congress, where in the Senate, it's like the New Jersey plan, where everybody gets 2 votes. And in the House, it's based on population. So states with higher populations have more votes. So like California has way more votes than Georgia, okay? And then after they figured out big states and small states, they went to the issue of slavery. The issue of slavery is that in the South, a big part of our population was made up of slaves. And they were worried that if they weren't allowed to count their slaves as part of their population, then they wouldn't have as many votes in the House of Representatives. And so the North wouldn't let them count all of their slaves. They said, we will compromise and we'll let you count some of your slaves. So on paper, the U.S. government said that a slave counts as 3/5 of a person. So for every 5 slaves, they counted as 3 people, okay? And that's going to sort of solve that problem. But at the end of the day, the government's basically telling the slaves that you're not a whole person, which is bad, right? Then we had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, they thought the Constitution was a good idea. They thought having this strong central government with an army that could have taxes and enforce their laws would make us safer, which it would. But the Anti-Federalists were nervous that this government could step on the rights of the people. And so the Anti-Federalists, led by Thomas Jefferson, say, give us something to show us that you can't take away our rights. And so they come up with the first 10 amendments, which are at the very end of the Constitution, the first amendments called the Bill of Rights, which protect our individual freedoms, like freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of religion and right to own guns and not to be searched whenever we want, the right to a trial, these very important sort of individual freedoms that we have, okay? Then the two men at the bottom there are the signers of the Constitution from Georgia. William Few, basically all you have to know is that he signed the Constitution from Georgia. Abraham Baldwin, though, he's important because he's the one who changed his vote during the voting of the Constitutional Convention, and he's the one who helped get the Great Compromise passed. We also would want to know that he becomes the first president of the University of Georgia. They hire him to sort of get together all of the information for writing the charter. And then remember that it's Lyman Hall who actually signs the charter, because he's the governor, who grants the charter for UGA, okay? So that's important. Then there are two principles there of government that you have to know. Separation of powers, the three branches of government. That's what it is. And we know that the executive enforces the law. We know that the judicial interprets the law, meaning they decide how the law is supposed to be applied. And then the legislative branch makes the laws, okay? Checks and balances, though. Checks and balances is the idea that no branch of our government should be more powerful than the others. So the legislative branch has power over the president, the executive, but the executive has power over the legislative, okay? So in this instance, the legislative branch can impeach the president if he does something wrong. The president can veto the laws that the Congress makes, but then the Congress can also check that power and they can override his veto, okay? The judicial branch, their checks and balances is something called judicial review. They can review the laws that Congress makes to decide if they're constitutional or not, and they can do the same thing with the president. The president's actions can be declared unconstitutional, and that makes them invalid, okay? And so it's important that you know that. Also, the legislative branch checks the judicial because they get to approve judges. Make sure you study that triangle that you have in your notes, and that you understand that basically it's just one way there's one way that each branch can check the power of each other one, and it keeps any of them from becoming too powerful. All right. The next thing we have is the westward expansion. Remember that after the Revolutionary War, more people are going to be coming into Georgia. And as the population center of the state changes, so does the capital. And we had 5 capitals, and there's an acronym called SALMA, S-A-L-M-A, Savannah, Augusta, Louisville, Milledgeville, Atlanta. And you want to know that basically over time, the population goes west. You do want to know that Savannah was first, and that's where Oglethorpe was, and that's where the Indians gave us the land. You want to know that Augusta was the second capital, also on the Savannah River. Each of these capitals is going to be near a water source because that's kind of important for transportation and for drinking the water and power later. All of those things. You would want to know that Louisville was named after King Louis XVI, who helped us in the Revolutionary War. You would want to know that the Yazoo land fraud takes place in Louisville. You want to know that Milledgeville is named after John Milledge, the guy who donated the land for the University of Georgia, which is why it's in Athens today. And then you want to know the story of Atlanta. You want to know that Atlanta started off as a train depot called Terminus. Then, after the city had been established for a while, one of the governors named Lumpkin, he changed the name to Marthasville. And then after he is no longer governor, the legislative branch changes the name again to Atlanta, which was named after the Western and Atlantic Railroad. The reason why it was named Atlanta was because its sort of history as a transportation hub. All of the big train stations, or train tracks, ended in Atlanta in one spot, and then you could sort of travel to other places in the state. So that's going to be important, which today Atlanta is still important for transportation with the airport and the highways and things like that, okay? You do want to know the story of how religion changes in Georgia after the Revolutionary War. You want to know that before the war, most of the people in Georgia were like first or even second generation immigrants, meaning they were people who were born in England, or they were the children of people that were born in England. So they followed the Church of England, which was we call Anglican. And the person who's in charge of that Anglican church is the king. And once we are done with the Revolutionary War, most of the people in Georgia are not going to want to follow a religion where they believe that the guy in charge of their church is the king. So two big Christian denominations sort of become popular in Georgia, the Baptists and the Methodists. And we said that those are still the most popular types of Christian denominations in Georgia today. So, and in the South, really. So just make sure you know that they had to change because of the war, and they became mostly Baptists and Methodists, okay? We talked about UGA a little bit already, but just remember that it's the first public university, which means it gets money from the state, which makes it cheaper for the students to go there and more available for students to go there. You want to know that Abraham Baldwin served as the first president of the university. You want to know that Lyman Hall was the governor who signed the charter, which granted them that original land, but they didn't actually use that land. They sold it, and then when John Millage was the governor, he donated more land to the university, and that's why it's in Athens today, okay? The next thing I have is land policies. Remember that Georgia, after the war, we had lots of people coming in, and we needed to, how are we going to decide who lives where and how much land people get? And they had 3 different ways. The first way was the headright system, where if you were an adult white male over the age of 21, you could get free land. If you had a family, you got an additional 50 acres for each member of your family. If you owned slaves, you got another 10 acres for each slave, up to 1,000 acres. The problem is that the headright system, they had too many people trying to claim the land. Some people were trying to claim more than that 1,000 acres. And so they started to run low on the land, and it was too hard to kind of keep up with. So they do away with that. Then, the sort of next major push for land in Georgia is this thing called the Yazoo Land Act, which is also called the Yazoo Land Fraud later. So what happened was 4 companies go to the people, the Congress in Louisville, and say, hey guys, you can sell us this land very cheaply. These 4 companies, all of this Yazoo territory, which is today modern day Alabama and Mississippi. And if you sell us this land very cheap, when we sell it, we'll give you, not the government, but the individual congressman, a cut of that money. So it was a bribe, which is illegal. And so when the people of Georgia found out about this, they got angry. The problem is that land had already been sold. And when the land was sold, the people who bought it didn't know about the fraud. They didn't know that they were buying land that was, that those companies had gotten illegally. And so when the people in Georgia tore up the Yazoo Land Act and they basically made the law go away, the Congress had to repeal the act, all of those people that had bought that land, their money was gone and their land was gone. So they got angry and they sued the state of Georgia. And when they sued the state of Georgia, Georgia couldn't pay all of those lawsuits. It was over $3 million. And so the federal government comes in and they pay off those lawsuits, but in return, Georgia had to agree to sell all of their land west of the Chattanooga River to the federal government, which is what becomes Alabama and Mississippi, because remember the original boundary was up to the Mississippi River, okay? The last way that we decided to try to give out land was through a land lottery, which means that, if you were an adult white male, you got 1 ticket. If you had a family, you got 2 tickets. If you were a widower, if you were a female whose husband had died and you had children, then you got 2 tickets to put into the land lottery. Veterans got 2 tickets. Basically, it was a way to try to give out the land in a sort of fair way, but it was random. Unlike the headright system, you weren't guaranteed land just for being an adult white male, okay? All right, the next thing we have is the story of the Creek. Now, this story, you have to remember that the Creek and the Americans sort of start having tension or anger amongst each other because the Creek sided with the British during the Revolutionary War. And because of that, after the war, the Americans are not going to like them that much. And also, they stopped being able to trade as easily with the Americans because the Americans, they got deer and other sort of animals from the creek, but those animals the populations kind of went down a little bit and they were harder to get. So the Indians weren't useful from a trade standpoint, and they had sided with the wrong people during the war. And so then the Americans are going to keep taking their land and taking their land, eventually until the Creek start fighting amongst themselves about whether or not they should fight with the Americans. The Red Sticks said, we should fight, we should try to keep our land. The White Sticks said we should not do that, and they started fighting each other until eventually the Americans got involved. Andrew Jackson shows up and fights against the Red Sticks, and eventually the Americans are going to win this war. And what happens is the Creek are forced to sell millions of acres of land back to the American government. And the rest of the land that gets taken away from them happens because of this guy right here. This is McIntosh. McIntosh is a Creek chief who basically rises to prominence because he helps the Creek through a famine with food that he gets from the American government. And then once he becomes chief, the Americans make a deal with McIntosh saying, hey, sell us your land, sell us the land of the Creek, and we'll give you money. And so he sold the Creek land out from under them. And when he did that, the Creek found out, and they were still kicked out of Georgia, but they murdered McIntosh. Okay, so that's going to be important. The next story is the Cherokee, and the Cherokee story is very different than the Creek story, because where the Creek tried to fight with the Americans, the Cherokee are going to try and work something out, because the Cherokee also sided with the British during the war, but after the war, they're going to try to assimilate with the Americans a little bit. They're going to try to open up their territory and let the Americans travel through it and build roads if they need to. They're going to let Christian missionaries come into their territory and teach them English and teach them about Christianity. They're going to try to have a written language, the Sequoia and the syllabary. They're going to try to institute a court system so that their justice system is more like the Americans. They're going to have a newspaper like the Americans. They're going to try to do everything to make themselves seem more civilized to the Americans. The problem is that in 1828, gold is found in Dahlonega and in sort of North Georgia, and that just happens to be the land populated by the Cherokee. And so because of that find of gold, the Cherokee are going to be forced to leave. When they are told that they are going to be forced to leave, the chief of the Cherokee, a guy named John Ross, he decides that he's going to organize a petition first. Then he's going to get the Christian missionary, Samuel Worchester, to represent the Cherokee in court. And they are going to hire lawyers, and they are going to sue the U.S. government and sue the government of Georgia. And that case becomes Worcester versus Georgia. And what you need to know is that the other names in the story are Andrew Jackson, the President of the United States, who does not like the Cherokee, and then John Marshall, who is the Supreme Court Justice. He's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And John Marshall hears the case, the Supreme Court hears the case, Worcester versus Georgia, and they decide that the Cherokee should be allowed to stay in Georgia. And so what they do is they basically argue that the court says I can stay, but Andrew Jackson, what he does is he says, John Marshall, you've made your decision, but I'm not going to enforce that ruling. I'm going to make the Cherokee leave anyway, all right? And when he does that, he is breaking checks and balances. The Supreme Court made their decision, so they've, interpreted the law. It's the job of the president to enforce that law, but he doesn't do it. Instead, he says, no, you guys have to leave. Now, Andrew Jackson was not president anymore during the Trail of Tears. His time had been up, and the president who was actually in office during the removal was his ex-vice president, Martin Van Buren. But at the end of the day, the Cherokee should have been allowed to stay. But because the Congress was scared about kind of going against Jackson, they were still removed. So Jackson did break the law, but he, wasn't removed from office, okay? All right, and the last thing I have up here is technology. Just make sure you know that railroads were important because it allowed the cotton farmers to move their cotton to where they were going to sell it, to the markets, cheaper and faster. You could move people cheaper and faster, so it opens up sort of trade, okay? You want to know that the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney, and you want to know what it does. It removes the seeds from the cotton, okay? You also want to know that he also invents this idea of interchangeable parts, which are machines that are made to be taken apart. Okay, so the thing he invented that way were guns. So like if the barrel of your gun broke, you could fix the gun. Okay. Also know that with the cotton gin, it made slavery worse because you needed more people growing cotton since you could process the cotton faster. Hopefully this answers all your questions. Good luck.